So this is actually an update on the black 88 M3, even though the car is still in the body shop. I'm working on the new engine for it, which is a 2001 BMW M3 engine. It's an S54B32. Same one I've got in the red car. I picked this up at a salvage yard just because it was a pretty good deal. The rod bearings I took out of it actually looked pretty darn good, but a little bit of wear nonetheless, and I had purchased these VAC calico bearings. I don't know where I set the box anymore. There it is. These guys, they're maybe 350 bucks from VAC. They're actually OEM bearings coated with some sort of moly coating. I'm not really sure. But anyway, I'm going to throw them in there because I already had them from the red car. I never ended up using them. As well as some ARP 2000 rod bolts to replace it, since the stock ones, they're not actually stretch bolts, but it's never good to reuse them if you can avoid it. So, I've never actually done rod bearings before. It varies application to application. There's a lot of manufacturers that'll run 5 or 6 different rod bearing sizes, and then you have to factor in wear on top. VAC only sells one size bearing for this car, and that assumes that the bearing you're taking out actually are okay for the most part, and it assumes your crankshaft is beautiful, which it is in this engine. So your clearances should stay pretty much exactly how they are. It might reduce your oiling clearance just a little bit, but as long as you break it in properly, it seems like nobody has problems with these bearings. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I've already done the first, not first 4, but I've done 1, 6, 3, and 4. I'm going to do 2 and 5 right now. The only thing I've done so far is I've loosened these. These are the rod bearing cap bolts. They are 12 millimeter, 12-point metric. Buy a few sockets, you're going to end up breaking them because they're really on there. Say they're on with about 100 foot-pounds of torque. So what I'll do generally, I'll pull one of the bolts up a little bit and I'll rock it, and it'll just come off like that. Rod bearings in there. Other one's obviously on the connecting rod. This one's pretty easy to get out of there. Actually, what I'll do typically is I'll just push. Yeah, it's hard to point. I'll generally just push down on that side of the bearing and it'll slide right out. If that doesn't work, push on this side of it. Just kind of push it down and it'll diagonally wander out of there. Rip that one out of there. Kind of do the same for the other one. The best way I've found to kind of get these out is to push it down by hand until it's kind of past the crank. Don't let it go too far. And then get both hands and kind of pull it back up. I won't be able to do it on camera here, but that'll give you access to the rod bearing. Same procedure. Just kind of push it out to the side. I can probably actually do it on this one. Yep. So that one just came right out. I'm setting them in order just so I can take a look at them, mark them, and keep them for future reference just in case somebody has questions or I need to know kind of about the health of the engine in certain areas. So once you've got the old bearings out, your new bearings are going to look a lot like that. This is a new VAC coated bearing. Notice they're gray. Pretty fancy looking. Before you end up putting that in your bearing cap, you're going to want to get assembly lube. You don't have to use Lucas. It's kind of whatever's available. Put about an M&M size drop, maybe a little bit less in the center of the bearing, and move it around with a clean pair of gloves. Do that to both bearings. You want to make sure you do that. You don't want to dry spin. There's a little bit of oil on the crank still, but you don't want to do damage to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you how to insert the bearing in the bearing cap. So that's generally about the size of assembly lube you want to rub on it, just for reference. When you're done, you should have a nice sheen on your bearing, and you're ready to put this in the bearing cap. Basically, when you're putting these things in the bearing cap, this will vary a little bit engine to engine, but there is a little kind of bump out on the end of the bearing there, and there's going to be a bump out on your bearing cap. Align that edge, the top of the bearing, to the top right here, this rough edge, and then once that's aligned, keep it aligned and push it down into the bearing cap. So if that was too hard to kind of grasp, just keep that top edge of the bearing even with the top edge of this side of the rod bearing big end cap, and then push this side in. It shouldn't take much force. It should just kind of snap right in, and they'll hold in pretty well. So do that again on your connecting rod in the engine. And then once you've done that, lubed it up, sort of drag it back up with your fingers onto the crankshaft. And then use your old bolts, and we're going to kind of tighten it down just to set everything up, and then we'll take it back apart and check it. So I have the connecting rod. It's got a new bearing in it. It's got assembly lube on it. I just pulled it back up with my fingers, reaching behind it, pulling it back up. I've got my bearing cap. On the S54, they're marked with a little yellow paint dot. That's going to face to my left here. Just make sure you're matching them up to whatever you see on the rest of your engine. Generally, that will be aligning, aligning that little notch on the side with a little notch. The other side should just be flat. That's for oiling. So just pop that right back down there. Make sure you're perfectly aligned. These are fracture split connecting rods, so it's very, very crucial you get them exactly back in their groove, because that's the only way they'll fit. A lot of engines, these are just machined caps, so it's also very easy to get them mixed up. That's why I only do one at a time generally. But once you've got this, throw your original bolts back in it, tighten them down by hand, and then we're just going to snug them, take them back off, check the bearing, make sure everything looks okay, and then we'll put the ARPs in. So I snugged it back down with the original bolts, pulled it back off, basically just to check and make sure that that top edge is still even. If it's moved around at all, you're going to want to correct that, because you don't want to spin a bearing, you don't want to get the wrong oiling clearance. In my case, it all looked fine, so I'm going to pop the cap right back on it. Sorry, it's hard to film and get a decent result at the same time. I'm using ARP 2000, so I have a little bit of lube just for the seat of the bolt, and I've also put a little bit of their special lube on the tip of the bolt. They recommend that just for reassembly. Apparently it gives a better result. Engine oil works just as well, assembly lube works just as well. So thread those down by hand, and these are torqued to 70 foot-pounds. I'm torquing to 79, just seems better. I don't know, the originals were on there with like 100 foot-pounds, so I'd say a little bit more than spec maybe, but don't go crazy, you don't want to break anything. So finger tight them down, then snug them up with a ratchet, and then get your torque wrench on them and tighten them down the rest of the way. And pretty much just repeat that process for the rest of the engine until you're done.